On today's More Than a Test, we welcome Tom Murray. Tom is an amazing author. He's an amazing speaker. If you've been to an EdTech event lately, there's a good chance he was a keynote or one of the big speakers there. He is absolutely incredible. One of the kindest, most wonderful people. Everything he tells you is about stories. And really what he's about is being human-centered and also innovative at the same time. He's got tangible stories. He's really funny, and you really can't miss it today on More Than a Test. Hey, Tom, thanks for being here today.
What an honor. Thanks for having me.
I've been actually really excited for this conversation because I met you very briefly back in like February or March in New York City at the League of Innovative Schools, where you were a keynote speaker. Do you remember that?
I do love New York. I'm a New Yorker, so got to give shout out to my New Yorkers, number one. And shout out to Digital Promise. They do incredible work. And I was honored to join such great district leaders, school leaders, such great partners that they have, like yourself and others. And what an honor it is to be here today.
It was really a special time because all of the breakout sessions were about AI and technology and you know, all these new innovations that are available. And your talk was all about connection and about people. Is that always kind of what you talk about, or did you pick that for that moment in that group?
Yeah, I always bring it back to the human side, the people side. And here's why. I'm a huge fan of ed tech. I love some of the stuff that's happening with AI and some of those pieces. But let me give you a quick example. I get to do a load of events every year, and here's where we're at. And it's not very different than other things we've seen in ed tech. But if I were to submit a session right now to a conference and I put AI in the title, it's going to get in and the room is going to be packed. If I were to submit a session and it was something about pedagogy, I'm going to have 4 district leaders sitting in the front row, right? And so when I know that, we've got to take a look at how do we decipher between the hype and the excitement, which isn't necessarily bad. I mean, what's coming, and I've signed some NDAs to see what's coming from some of these large companies, and it's going to blow our minds what's possible. But like anything, the human side is always going to reign supreme. And I've got a story maybe that I'll share where it really hit me with that coming up personally and on a personal note, and where it really brought that out. Technology is always going to be, when we look at the hands of educators, when we look at things around ed tech. I've been in the ed tech industry per se for 20 years or so, doing kind of different work there. And when you take a look at the research from an education teaching practice end, what it really shows, and I'm way overgeneralizing here, but what it boils down to, great teachers, it'll make better. Poor instruction, it'll actually make it worse. And we don't talk about that side a whole lot. We talk about the possibilities, we talk about the awesome stuff, but here's what it boils down to. It's the people that still makes the difference there. And so when we take a look at that, the other piece that I would say, it's the SEL, the mental health side, all of that reigns supreme when I look at it through the eyes of my own children and what I want for them and all those different pieces, the human side, we cannot lose that in this equation. But here's the positive. When we combine the awesome human, call it HI, the human intelligence, the human side, with things like AI, what becomes possible is really, really exciting with some guardrails.
Okay, now I have to dial in on a few things. And so you said so much, it's great. I want to talk about this. It'll make the bad teachers worse.
Yep.
Because I think there are a lot of us, building the AI products thinking that we might be able to save ourselves from bad teachers. I'll give you an example that's not a mirror. Chiron Learning, part of what they're doing is an AI tutor, but it starts with the best teacher in the district. So they go to a district and they're like, give us your best teacher, and then we'll replicate what they're doing through AI as a tutor. To me, that seems like if you have a really bad teacher, but at least they get like the best teacher, via AI, that should make them better. Tell me a little bit more about why you say it's going to make bad teaching worse.
Yeah, so I think, and we've seen that with a lot of ed tech. I'll give you an example. Some of the pieces that are already there, but are going to be more prominent from an education end. Let's say I'm in a learning management system. It knows that on my class is 4th grade. I can instantly say, create a lesson plan for this. Now, let's pause on that. In theory, that's a great starting point. But it's also saying, for an average 4th grade kid, here's what we would be teaching. What I know is I don't necessarily want my teacher to always just shoot for average. That's the first thing. Second piece is when we look at it, let's do what's possible where the corpus of the AI, where it's pulling all its data sets from, is going to be very customized down. I mean, it's already starting to be, but especially down the road when you start to look at different district products, and there's whole copyright pieces that have to be worked out with that. But if I'm a district and I can leverage AI to understand and load the corpus with the information from all these different vendors and products and where they're buying their curriculum and their curriculum maps and all that, huge potential. But when I look into a system and I'm able to say, create me a lesson plan, and I do it in seconds, if I were to, and again, I'm as pro teacher as they come, but if I were to, okay, print it out, there's my lesson plan, and then say, okay, now personalize for Johnny over here based on that. Okay, go ahead and do that now, Johnny. Here's your playlist. And okay, now scan these documents to tell me how Johnny's doing in writing. And I just take all that at face value, the kid's gonna have a worse experience. Why? Because it's
That
the
total
human side, right?
It
The
totally
other,
makes sense.
yeah,
It's Go ahead. Go Well, I
yeah,
mean, what you're saying is what we already know, right? Is that if you take a great curriculum and put it with a bad teacher and they don't take the time to read through it and to learn it and really make it individualized for the kid, it doesn't matter that it's a great curriculum because it's a bad teacher. And AI
yep,
has the same
yep.
fault. What's the other thing you were going to add?
Yeah, so let me share the example because maybe this is a really good fit here for the personal
Great.
story of where it really hit me. So a number of months ago, I messed up my shoulder, and I had to end up. I went to the doctor. They wanted to do an MRI. So after the MRI, within a few days, I get the results in my portal, and we've all seen that. And that's a double-edged sword, right? Because you start looking at it, and you're like, what does this mean? Am I going to die tomorrow? Right? Like my shoulder. So I take the information and I use ChatGPT every day. I got the paid version. I'm using it in different ways, and I was like, what if I did this? So I took all my results from my portal, I put it into ChatGPT, and I said, I just had an MRI on my right shoulder. Can you help me understand the results? It says, sure, share the results. So I share the results. It sends it back to me, and I'm like, yeah, I'm still not that smart. Like, help me understand further. So I say, like, make that easier for me to understand. And so it spits it out. I'm like, okay, now we're talking. I was like, I'm curious. And I basically said, like, tell it to me like I'm a high schooler. And it was like, your right shoulder hurts. And I'm like, all right, now we're about at my intelligence level. This is a good thing. So then I asked it and I said, okay, so explain to me what's wrong with my shoulder, because it was very medically oriented, of course, in the portal, the way it was written, basically explained, like in layman's terms, that I have a partially torn rotator's cuff. And so I asked it, I said, what do doctors typically prescribe for those kind of things? What would my options be traditionally? And so they gave me three options. Doctors typically will offer this, this, or this. So I go into, and I have a good relationship with the doctor. I know the doctor. That's an important piece to this. So I do all that without my doctor knowing, and I'm just really curious. So my doctor comes in and my follow-up results and hands me the MRI results was literally like the printout from the portal. And I said, hey, I said, doc, listen, can I tell you what I think you're going to tell me is wrong? And he kind of looked at me, or she looked at me like, what do you mean? I said, can I explain to you what I think is wrong? And then what I think you're going to tell me my treatment options are? And she's like, why, where's this coming from? And I said, I gotta ask you, are you doing anything with AI or chat GPT or anything? And she's like, I haven't, but everybody's talking about it. I said, here's what I think you're going to tell me. And I literally had my notes on it. And I said, I think you're going to tell me that this, and this is wrong. And then here's my three options, surgery, if I want to be able to do these things, physical therapy, if I want to just strengthen enough, but I won't be able to do these things, and goes through. And she looked at me and I was like, now, I'm not looking to replace you by any means. That would be a really bad idea. I don't want a computer system deciding, ultimately doing the surgery pieces there with that, right? Like, help me decide, think through with me why this would be bad. Like, walk through. And again, I've got the relationship with the doctor here. And she was like, number one, that's fascinating what you just did. Because I showed her, like, make it easier for me to understand, make it easier for me. And it did. It quantified it in a different way. And then she said to me, and she looked at it and she said, here's the thing, medically, it was actually right. And so what they've seen a lot with a lot of these things, because it can pull from this corpus that has medical information, that's kind of like, this means rotator cuff, right? So that's pretty straightforward. She said, here's the problem with what you just did. What if it wasn't your shoulder? What if it was something different with your body and you were diabetic, but you didn't share that? And then I go to
Wow.
treat you in one way, that could actually do real harm. What if you have a family history of this, and this? It didn't know to look for that. The bigger picture becomes, well, what if the AI could then scan all of your medical records ever to understand that? Well, that's an interesting question, isn't it? The whole privacy thing comes into place here. And so it was,
Right.
here's why I share all that. It hit me in that moment when she said that, of like, it was helpful. It was a great tool, but I would also say, from a guardrail end, what if it wasn't something? And the reason I was willing to do that, it was because it was my shoulder, and it's like, it's not the end of the world here, right? Worst case scenario, I'll
Right.
get surgery. But what if it was like a really unique form of cancer, and I had a month or two to live,
Wow.
and I'm sitting in my car in a parking lot by myself randomly? I have concerns about that, right? What if, for instance, that the example from the human side of, like, it didn't understand all these things, so now the treatment that I think I need is actually very different because it didn't understand holistically like my doctor would, right? And so, yes, AI could do like, what questions do you need to know? What else do you need to know? There are other real possibilities there, but it hit me in two ways. One is the importance of the human side. I never want to get to a point where we say we don't need doctors because AI can just figure it all out. Because the questions
Right.
in those pieces and knowing me as an individual and knowing my, family or what a time commitment, like all those different pieces plays a role. So the human piece, it keeps coming back to that, but also recognizing it's a great tool. It was super helpful because 3 weeks before I could get into the doctor, I had a pretty good idea of what was going to be happening with it. But on the guardrail side, there's also some things we've just got to be really cautious of. And some of the things that I know are coming with AI from some of these larger companies, it gives me a little bit of pause. If we remove the human component, we can get all excited about a content end. But if this is just about redistributing content faster and more efficiently, we're missing the human piece. And so I think it's an and I think it's not an either or. I would say it's not going to be too far into the future where we'll start hearing AI schools. Like the moment, and listen, I built a virtual school in the public school district that I was in years ago, soon after like digital learning became a thing. And then that became this whole way of schooling. But there's some drawbacks. I don't want my 5-year-old sitting on a device all day long doing schooling, right? We saw
Right.
some of those through COVID, personal experience there. But are we going to start to see like, hey, come to this AI school? By the way, we can do it a lot cheaper because now we don't have to do this with parent. We don't have to pay our teachers this. And we don't have to do this. We'll just have somebody that kind of oversees the data in the background. I start to get some real pause with that, right? Because such of the human component to schooling happens on places like the playground and the lunchroom, lining up for recess. Like we can never lose sight of the importance of those pieces. So to me, it's an
Yeah.
and I think that's just an important component where that day it really hit me. That
I really love that. I love the story, and it makes so much sense to me. And I think the way that like I would say it back as a teacher and as a parent as is an AI can help my kid. It can support. There's lots of things that can happen there, but it will never know my child, and it will never love my child the way a teacher and a parent does. And I think that that's
I
really
love that.
valuable and important. I appreciate that you say it like that. I only spent a little time with you in New York, but one of the things I know about you is that you are like a rigorous optimist. So I got to let you come in on the other side. All right. So we've heard some of the things that we don't want to happen, right? We don't want the AI school. We need our doctors. We need our teachers. Tell me some things that you are really like jazzed about with AI.
Yeah. So the opportunity to personalize is amplified here. So I started to share earlier when districts have the ability, and it's almost there. And I think districts will start to play with it a little bit once we work out the copyright stuff. But when some of these really large districts start to say, hey, X product over here from whatever company, we want to be able to put this into our walled garden of AI so that we can map our curriculum to it and whatnot, it's going to make personalization much more efficient and much more possible when I can start to leverage like my scope and sequences based on curriculum and now truly create these interactive experiences, even cross curricular when they're able to do it. There's a lot to that we've got to be really conscious of, and somebody's still got to monitor that. But the ability to say, okay, hey, you're crushing third grade math. We're going to actually step you up a few levels. Now I'm pulling all these different pieces that are still aligned, still part of the curriculum. I'm not just going to a random website to do extra work. There's some real possibilities there. And so that's some of the stuff that excites me. I would say for that for sure. And, a lot of what we're seeing now is really just pulling from things that are already online in the open internet. We've got to be really conscious of that. The conversations that are so paramount right now, so important around things like bias and who creates that corpus, where does that information pull? Because just like I mentioned earlier with EdTech, if it's pulling from databases that have significant biases, I don't want to say anything's ever going to be bias free, right? Like that's a utopian-esque thought. I mean, we want to shoot for that for sure, but it's a consideration we've got to think about. When we look at that, when we have some of those good data sets and pieces that it's actually pulling from, possibilities are very real. But with a lot of different places that are trying to, and some of it's not filtered, some of the things are filtered with tokens, and that gets pretty technical with some of those pieces. Possibilities are really, really there, but the precautions have to be there as well. So yesterday I was on a call, and you had to say you're either super excited or super nervous about AI, and you couldn't do 50-50. I said super excited because the opportunity to personalize, the opportunity for efficiency is there. I think a lot of the efficiencies we see, and it's this hard balance in the conversation of like, we're not looking to make like, gee, let's make teaching so easy so I can just sit at my desk all day and don't have anything to do. That's not the conversation. That's not the goal. But when I can automate certain tasks to build me more time to be able to spend with learners directly, that's a real positive. And so I think some of the things from a efficiency end are great. Many times, another piece that it gets me excited as a former tech director for a couple of years, so many times the left hand didn't know what the right hand was doing in systems, and I've got to go over here for gradebook, and I go over here for attendance, and I go over here for the IEP, and I go over here for this, and like we worked on things like single sign on and all those things. But show me a system where people are like, all of our stuff talks together really really well, and we can find it all in one spot, and like, show me that place, right? And so with it, I think the opportunity for it to truly be able to get more of a 360-degree view of children in real time with learning goals aligned to targets and those kinds of things is going to be much more efficient, which is going to allow the teacher to be able to modify much quicker and be able to personalize in a much more efficient manner. I'm thinking about those people that have high school students and 150 kids on their rosters, right? Where just the time essence, there's only so many hours in a day. The opportunities there are going to become much more vast from an efficiency end. And so I think that efficiency piece is key, so long that the additional time that's created is used for like human-centered interactions and kid-focused type learning.
It reminds me, I saw this thing in the New York Times and it was like, I want AI to fold my laundry and sweep the floor, not like create my art and my time with my children. And I thought that
Love
was
that.
really well
Love
put
that.
of
Totally agree.
finding that efficiency piece. I think one of the things that you were saying, and like my head automatically nodded, every educator listening will definitely resonate, is this idea of, yes, there's potential for AI. Yes, we should be using it. But what did you say? You said the human side reigns supreme. Tell me, how does a district leader lead in that way? How do they open themselves to innovation and
Yep.
also let the human side be the most important thing they're doing?
So and I could give some shout outs. Like when I think about AI leadership and human side right now, got to give a shout out to my buddy Jerry Almendarez. He's the superintendent in Santa Ana, California, an incredible district, and they're doing a lot of work around AI and discovery and visioning, and well, what are the guardrails we need. But he's such an incredible superintendent, and so the things that I would say, I think of him number one because he puts people first, and so recognizing that like our people are our greatest asset. It's not a piece of technology. It's recognized that we're in a people first organization. Can't lose sight of that. But I would say, what do they do specifically is they model it, right? It's so easy for a leader to say, I need you to do this. You need to do that. You need to do this. But what are they ultimately doing? And so the best leaders that are trying to change culture, the best leaders that are trying to show the human side is they model it. And that comes with, and when they mess something up, because they're human, they own it, and then they model their staff the vulnerability of, gang, I decided that a month ago, and guess what? You were right, it didn't work, and I need to own that. But we got to get this right for kids, and I need your help to fix it. Like those moments of vulnerability give our teachers the same when a lesson goes sideways to pick up the pieces and keep moving forward. Which, by the way, give our students the same opportunity to say, you know what, like learning's messy and that didn't work. I got to figure out a different way to do this, right? And so they model it, but they also lead with vulnerability, and I would add humility, right? And I think I know the best leaders that I see across the country, somebody like Jerry and some others out there that I could certainly name, are visioning and understanding we can't put our head in the sand when it comes to this is changing every aspect of every industry. It really, really is. But at the same time, we need to put our people first. We need to model the way, and we need to keep it that being that we're educators, we're in the people business here. Let's not get out of the people business and just have tech leading the way in all aspects of things. That when you look at things around, mental health with technology and social media and some of those conversations that are happening, when you look at some of those pieces, we have to bring it back to like people and what's best for kids and the human side of that work. And that's why I keep going back to it's an and when it comes to this conversation.
Okay, so what I hear you saying is these leaders need to be innovative, like open to new ideas, humble enough to say when they're wrong and to model it and like experiment in front of people, right? Like show them, hey, I'm going to fumble too. And that they also need to kind of, I think you keep using the word guardrails of like, just how much time are we talking about? What are we saying? The one thing that I'm having a hard time really pinpointing what you mean by, and I hear this all the time, is what does it truly mean in a world that is moving this fast with technology to be human first?
Yeah, so you're right. We say that all the time. I say that all the time, right? So I think it's making sure that people are part of processes, protocols, and essentially the outcomes, right? So when we look at like as we go to change, I just use Jerry as an example, making sure that our people are part of decision making, making sure that our people are front and center in that conversation, making sure like when we talk about changing things in classrooms, are we asking kids? Are kids part of this conversation? or are we doing things to them? And so I think on one hand, it's making sure that they're uber involved in every aspect of these conversations so that we have a diverse set of voices and a lenses helping to make decisions, right? I think that's the one side. The other side is constantly asking the question of, are we losing human connection in what we're doing? Do we all of a sudden now have kids spending time? And again, I'm a huge fan of ed tech, but are they now spending 80% of their day staring at a screen individually? And we're like, we're building collaboration skills, right? Like that's kind of awkward, right? That's not the way it is. And so I think it's bringing it back to as well as just the human interaction piece, the side by side. Again, as much as the, and I guess one of the biggest reference points we have for that would be COVID, right? When you look at COVID and going virtual and all those pieces, what did everybody say they missed the most? It was the people side. It was giving the hug, the high five. I remember talking to a principal doing a podcast, and I was interviewing this principal, and the principal was like, Tom, at this point, I would sit in my office and do bus referrals with kids all day if I had to, just to be in the same space. Right. And that hit hard for me because having been an assistant principal that's had to do those things, that's not the most fun thing. But it was the human side, the people side. It wasn't just doing everything with tech, right? Like the physical, the hug, the touch, the high five, the learning, being at recess and playing games and learning those different pieces. That's the stuff that we can't get away from as much as we leverage technology. People often, we talk to from a supervision end, like, what are the look fors? You walk into a classroom, you got 30 kids on 30 devices. Is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? How do we know? What does it look like? And to dive into, you have to really know what works. And so, we could talk about the effective use of ed tech, the explore, the design, the create, like the deeper ends of Webb's depth of knowledge or Bloom's taxonomy, like all that. But on the other side is like, what's that end goal from the people oriented, the human side? That's where you could also talk the mental health piece, the social pieces, the social interactions. I think there's a lot of ways you can answer that. When we talk about human oriented, for me, we're talking the mental, the mental health, the social pieces, the different things that I've mentioned already. So I guess it depends really ultimately on the context, but those are the things that we can't have, in my opinion. I wouldn't want for my own child, they hop on a device, the AI is perfectly meeting them where they all are all day. They sat there for 10 hours. They're now a zombie and they now try to go to soccer practice and can't interact with other kids. Right? Like that's not my
Yeah,
end goal here. However,
I
because of the ability to personalize, there's so much potential, but we can't let it be just technology all the time. And I say that as a huge fan of EdTech.
I hear you so much in that. One of the things, I have 4-year-old twins, and the way my husband and I say the same thing is like, when we go camping, it's wild, right? Like it is wild. We have so much to carry, it is so much stuff. But my kids don't fight at all when we go camping. They are so happy to be outside and be playing. Like they are the angels that it's so worth it for us because it's just like their natural happy state is to be outside under trees playing in a river. And the same thing with technology. The more we put them on TV, the more we seem to have like issues in our house of like 2 4-year-olds acting wild, And so I think that I see that in my own. I'm sure you don't have an answer to this, but I'm going to ask it anyways. Do you have a number of like kids should not be on screens more than an hour a day? Like, is there a number that you
Right.
think that schools should be using as their goal, or how can we help people figure
Right.
that out?
Yeah, and you know what? Before I answer that, the other piece I really should have mentioned in the human centered piece, I have to say is relationships. A relationship with a chat bot is going to be very different than a relationship with a teacher that I know loves and cares about me, is going to kick me in the butt when needed, going to hold me accountable, going to say to me like, hey, I know you can do better, go back and do some more, right? That's part of that human side, the people side, right? So to answer your question, I would say I don't have an answer to that because to me it depends. For me, it depends on what they're doing. So when you look at the effective use of ed tech and research behind it, um, what is it that actually works? When kids are using ed tech to explore, to design, to create, those are deeper level type skills. A lot of your STEM stuff falls into that. To me, I could make the judgment of like, well, if I'm doing that kind of stuff, my brain is really working in one way compared to more consumption based. Now, consumption is not inherently bad. Like we're going to do it and we can learn things. But what I mean by that, so my son, Caden, who's 11 years old, if I let him sit on YouTube Kids all day long, he would sit there and watch it for 24 hours a day. Can he learn stuff? Yes. It's going to be lower level though. And so what I would say in answering that question is it depends based on, well, what's the task that they're doing? To me, it's not the amount of time, it's the what they're doing during that time. If I'm highly engaged in deeper level stuff, leveraging technology, to me, in my opinion, I'm going to be able I should be able to spend more time doing that because my brain is really thinking and I'm problem solving and maybe collaborating, whatever these things. If it's that more consumption based, right? When you look at the new national EdTech plan, they look at the digital use divide as one area here. That consumption based, if I'm just consuming at much more of a lower level and it's during classroom time, I have to also then be able to say I'm investing more time in lower level learning. So the more time I do with consumption, the more time I'm investing in lower level learning. There's only so many hours, only so many hours in the day, right? And so I know like the American Association of Pediatrics, they'll say, what is it, 2 hours based on like roughly where his age is, kind of at a max. I'm not the doctor side here. Obviously, I shared that earlier on. I need my chat GPT, from like a blue light ends, there can be some impacts there. I can't speak to that from a medical end. I'm not nearly as proficient in that as I should be to speak to those kinds of things. Like, how does it impact your eyesight and those kinds of things? I don't know. I think it's something we should probably look at. I don't want an environment. And again, I helped lead a virtual school in a public school in 2008, 2009, 2009, 2010. So I'm a
Wow.
fan of it. But again, I don't want to just put a kid behind a device all day long because we miss out on a lot. So I'm not sure if I answered your question on that. I didn't avoid it. It's just the answer to me is it depends based on what the
On what they're
task
doing.
is and what they're actually doing as to what I would say would be a recommended amount.
No, a good friend of mine, John Campbell, helped lead the design school at Stanford, and he said the same thing. He's someone I often go to for advice for my kids, and he said,
Sure.
we brought out devices when there was something good to do with them, right? So, like, you want to
Yep.
build a birdhouse, and this is going to
Yep.
help you design it. We're all
Yep.
for it. And so, a good question that we ask as parents, and I see teachers asking, is, are they active? And as a product that we develop, kids are actively reading out loud on a Mira as opposed to clicking and gaming or taking things in like YouTube, right? So instead of asking what's on the screen necessarily, asking what's happening with your child
Yep.
and what that interaction looks like, I think is really valuable.
Yeah.
I think it's really clear that I super like value your opinion. And like, I'm like, okay, I'm asking for my kids, I'm asking for the teachers, I'm asking for my product. And you become this expert across education communities. I'm curious, like, how did you make that leap? Because you were a teacher before, you worked in Bucks County. Tell me a little bit about how you switched
Sure.
to this like role that you're in now.
Yeah, so it's been quite a journey, and I will say first and foremost to thank all the people along the way that have opened doors and given me opportunities and possibilities. I always never want to say the word I, because there's nothing that I've done in my life that has just been me and only me, and I mean that. So first, from just a humility end, just to say like a thanks to those people that have helped me get to where I am. So I started teaching elementary. I knew early, right out of college, I wanted to work with kids, younger kids. Loved it. Taught elementary for a number of years. Taught middle school for a number of years. Thought I was happy teaching middle school for all those years. Loved it. People either love it or hate it. I loved it. I had a principal one day walk in and said, "I've only got a couple of years left. I think you should run the building when I leave." I was like, that's interesting. I finished my third master's degree in ed leadership because of a principal that pushed me to do so. Didn't know the assistant principal would be leaving about a year later. Once I was finishing up, my assistant principal left, gave me the opportunity. Tried that out, was an assistant principal for a while, got that job full time, was an elementary principal for a while, went to district office because of an opportunity and at the event we were at, my superintendent, Lisa Andreyko, was there at the time. I got to thank her during the keynote in one of her last events, which was an amazing moment for me, just being able to do that. Somebody gave me an opportunity, brought me over. We created the first, one of the first, we're the first that we know of, virtual school by a public school taught by our own teachers in 2008, 2009, right? So the whole COVID, how does this look conversation was over a decade past when we had done it in our schools. I credit her with that, with having the vision with that. That ended up getting us featured on Digital Learning Day because of that, which is now something my team leads at Future Ready Schools and All for Ed. So we were featured on the second Digital Learning Day. And if you want to laugh, take a look at 2014 Digital Learning Day, Quakertown Community School District video. You'll see me looking a lot younger than I do right now, talking about how we want our kids to be able to learn virtually at home and at school and create. So we created almost this open campus feel at high school where you'd have kids come in for 2 periods a day. They could do their classes, maybe bio and bio lab. That's what they wanted to do. They'd go virtually. So people started to ask questions of like, can I graduate high school in 3.5 years? Like, why would we say no? right? And so we started, each girl that had gotten pregnant over the time, we had three of them, I believe, every one of them graduated because we had a different option for them, right? And so when we take a look, I will say that it was happening a lot in the state. We had like over 50 virtual charter schools in Pennsylvania that kids were leaving to. Some people can look at it and just complain and say, this is not fair. My superintendent and our team looked at it and be like, well, they're leaving because we're not offering something. They're leaving because it forced innovation. It forced us to think differently. That led to that spotlight on Digital Learning Day. She and I went down on Digital Learning Day, then we got the opportunity the following year to come back, be on a panel with Secretary Duncan at the time and Chairman Wheeler from the FCC. A couple of weeks later, I get an email saying, hey, we're looking for somebody that could work with school and district leaders that could do this. And I'm thinking, like, who do I know? Didn't realize it was that recruiting email at the time. Went to work for All for Ed about 10 years ago now, which is crazy to think about. Bipartisan, nonprofit, equity-focused organization out of Washington, D.C. So kind of in my day job, get to work. We have a policy team, work with the White House, the Senate, the Congress, equity-focused, but work with both sides of the aisles in different ways. Simultaneously, they give me a lot of freedom to write some books. So I've written a number of books, the last two being bestsellers, and get to speak around the country. Last year, I had the opportunity to do about 90 different events. Like you saw would be
Wow.
one example. A lot of convocations, a lot of leadership retreats, professional learning days, and those kinds of things as well. And so get to balance kind of both of those pieces. That's been part of the journey. But I will say I've learned a lot along the way, right? There's things that I think about and talk about now, read about, that I get to see a lot. There were so many things we were doing in our district that were like, wow, this is amazing. And it was really good. But I didn't necessarily have the whereabouts to be like, wow, this place over here was blowing it out of the water. And we weren't doing that, right? And so it's given me the opportunity to be able to see so much around the country, which helps me investigate a lot of things and have connections and work with the Department of Ed and work with other places to really build my own knowledge base in certain areas. And also recognize, going back to where I started, it's not an I thing, it's a we thing. And the opportunity to come together to say, how do we put our heads together to help solve some of the large issues that we have currently happening right now?
Wow, that's so great. It's such a great story. Let me tell you the two threads that I pulled that kind of go throughout. The first is this idea of personalized, individualized education. I really love that you use the three pregnant girls as opposed to like maybe like the three kids who are all going to work at NASA someday, right? Like the individualized education can help both our kids at the very top and our kids who are on different paths, right? And then the other thing is just being open to innovation. Did you know that that's who you were? That you were this person who really cared about each individual, like individualized and innovation, or is that just something that evolved?
No, the innovation side definitely evolved. I feel like, in my last book, you'll laugh based on what you just said, is called Personal and Authentic, right? And so that kind of describes what you just said, because for me, it's how do we create a personal experience and how do we create it so it's more authentic in nature as opposed to just this one size fits all. So to answer your question, in my first chapter of my last book, I talk about my first year teaching, and there were some very significant tragedies related to my education world in my life that year, my very first year, where I almost walked away. I legitimately was like, I can't do this. This is too emotional. This is too hard. And fortunately, I had a lot of people around me that rallied around to legitimately carry me through the rest of the year. But it fundamentally shifted my mindset from what I taught to who I taught. And for me, that was the shift of how do we focus on people and leverage content to support that person, as opposed to how do I focus on content and do it to these kids. It shifted my mindset on that. And so with that really brought me to the human side. The innovation side, I would say I've always had the urge to say, like, well, let's keep trying something new. So in my very second year, I love to tell the story, in my second year teaching, 22 years old, in 2001, I was one-to-one Palm Pilots. Remember those things, right? It was actually the beginning to mobility. But part of the reason I tell that story is, like, yeah, it was new, it was different. I remember people telling me, like, Palm Pilots will revolutionize education, right? And I also share a story from this end of my principal doing this observation, and it was he wanted to see this new spelling program. It was only 20 minutes. He wanted to come in. I'm like, absolutely, let's go, let's do this. He comes in, process this with me for a moment, because it's where I get part of my lens from. It was, to his credit, Bill Gretzula, I'll give him a shout out. It was a supervision conversation I remember now almost 25 years later, which shows the effectiveness of him from a principal end. I'll also say we had the relationship here, but maybe it'll help bring together some of the reason why I might think a little bit differently about some of this stuff. And so being one-to-one Palm pilots, I'm thinking to myself, well, I want to use technology for the lesson. I want every kid engaged for this lesson. And so he comes in, every one of my kids had individual spelling lists. I'm pretty proud of that 25 years later. And so anyway, here, the 20 minutes of the lesson really went like this. They essentially, I did something for a couple minutes, kind of whole class, holistically, quick review. We pulled out the Palm pilots and then I partnered them up and they were beaming. I would question you on your list. You would question me on my list. I'd write it on the Palm. I'd beam it over to you. You'd check it. We would go. We did that for like 15 or 16 minutes, brought it back together. And here's the thing. Every kid was involved every time. Every kid was 100% engaged. Every time I asked a question, so many hands went up. I'm thinking to myself at 22 years old, like, I'm going to drop the mic after this lesson. I'm so glad my principal was here to see it all because I just showed him what this is all about, right? I'm kidding, saying that tongue in cheek. But I go to him the next day and he says to me, and again, we had the culture, we had the relationship. He knew he was in a point to push me. And he says to me, so Tom, so what are the learning objectives for that lesson? And I was like, well, we wanted to use the Palm pilots to be able to. And he's like, no, stop. What are the learning objectives? And I'm like, you cut me off. Like, we wanted to use the Palm pilots to be able to. He's like, stop. I've asked you about the learning and you've talked about the tool twice. And he pushed me and he said, Tom, let me ask you a question. Again, we had the relationship, we had the connection. He wasn't ripping my heart out here. He said, could you have done the exact same things with your kids, pencil and paper, in 6 or 7 minutes? Yeah. But we took 20 minutes just because the Palms could do something? Yeah. And he's like, I really think you created the lesson because the Palm Pilot could do something, not because it was the best way to learn or practice something. I remember that 25 years later because here's the thing, he was spot on. We could have done that side by side, pencil and paper. And by the way, look at the difference between typing and handwriting. Technically, it was handwriting. It was just digital handwriting. But they were side by side. Had they done it pencil and paper, there would have been no tech issues, no snafus. It would have been quicker. He was spot on. I could have done it in a third of the amount of time and gotten the same done without using the tech. He wasn't anti-ed tech at all, but it stopped me in my tracks to say he was right. I started with, here's what the device can do. So why don't I do the lesson like that, which is backwards, as opposed to, here's what I need my kids to be able to do. Here's the learning outcomes that I want. What's the best way to get there? What's the best path to get there? In that case, it wasn't inherently wrong. I just took 3 times the amount of time to get the same outcome. That's not a good use of time, right? And so often we reinforce low levels of ed tech use. And if you're a principal listening to this, I'll give you a quick example. And I was guilty of it too. You've got your 5-minute walkthrough form. And one of the things in the walkthrough form says, students were using ed tech. Check. Here's my pushback. So what? Here's what I mean. Do we say students are using a textbook? Check. Students are using this? No, we're not. Because what if I'm going in and check, and it was all low level stuff? Are we celebrating it? Because we do all the time on social media, right? And so those moments I share because that also is the underlying thing from an AI end of I'm not one to just jump in head first and be like, we've got to all do this all the time. Because like, look at the, not to throw LAUSD under the bus. I don't mean it like that, but like, look at their whole chatbot stuff. And now what's all coming out of that company's going under. And here's these things over here. And look at this. And it costs $6 million and nobody's running all these pieces. It's like, whoa, we got to be really, really careful, thoughtful, and intentional would be the case there. LAUSD is trying to do some really cool, innovative stuff. I think it's really neat, some of the things they're doing. But also when we're first to the game, first to jump in, sometimes when you look back in retrospect, it's like, oh, we probably should have thought about some of these things. And we're seeing that very quickly happen with some of these tools in some of these areas. And so being intentional, being thoughtful, and really being evidence-based, I think matters here.
I want to go back to your spelling story. I loved it so much. And you just kept going, and you have so much great things to say that I don't want to cut you off. But I honestly got goosebumps because it feels like the story we all need right now about AI. Because there are I was at ISTE a couple weeks ago here in Denver, and I couldn't take 3 steps without tripping over a new AI tutoring something, right?
Yep.
And they're all offering it free to teachers who want to try it. So there's so much for teachers to try. And so I feel like what that lesson just taught me, and I haven't thought about this before, is first think about what I want for my kids and then go look for the tool that might help. Don't start with a tool that's getting thrown at me or puked at me or that I trip over at ISTE, but instead ask myself of like, what's the goal? And like at Amir, it's like, we want kids to read. Let's make them read out loud. And then, let's go like use ChatGPT to search for the tool that does that thing with kids. I think that that's really impressive. I'm going to mention one thing on LAUSD, and then I have to ask you one more question about this. So the LAUSD thing, it's so relevant right now. And I have, what I love so much about that story, and I'm going to give Alberto Carvalho a little bit of credit because I happen to like him, and because also, the first thing you said is a good leader is humble and willing to model it. And man, he was humble and willing to model it in a time when a lot of people are afraid to stand up first. So it'll be interesting to see. He always seems to find a way to turn things around. So I'm curious to see what comes out next.
Yeah.
But I will say, like, that part he got right. We'll see what happens with
Yeah.
the tech. And
Yeah.
it's not surprising that the
Absolutely.
tech let him down.
Yep, absolutely, and right, and it's not his fault where it comes to like that whatever company, whatever it was, essentially, I don't know if dissolved, people left, whatever it might be. I mean, that wasn't his fault, and kudos for him to say there's a different way to do this. There's a better way to meet kids' needs. We can leverage AI to do certain things differently. So again, not throwing. That's why I wanted to be clear and say not throwing them under the bus
Yeah.
at all. But like because things are so new, things can happen in a negative way. I worry about some privacy pieces with some startups with certain pieces. Again, if I'm a small ed tech startup and not knocking them, it's not their fault. They're getting started. They've got an idea. They want to do something. If I'm really, really tiny and small there, I don't have the resources to do some of the things right away with some of the privacy pieces, when I look at some of the AI, I'll give you an example, think back to some of the debacle that happened with images in Google and some of the pieces there, right?
Right.
And it was like, well, this is one of the largest, most wealthy companies in the world. And it happened, not the
Right.
startup with 2 or 3 people. And that's why we've got to be really intentional and thoughtful. And I too was at ISTE, and going back to it, if I created that session of 60 apps in 60 minutes, people are lining on the floor to get in, but shifted on like personalizing learning for kids. I've got a bunch of administrators sitting in the first couple of rows. It shows something there, right? And just like walk through that vendor floor, what percent of those companies won't be around in 3 or 4 years, if not even sooner? Got to be really conscious of that. Doesn't mean they're bad.
Well,
Everybody starts small, but we've got to be really intentional and ask a lot of questions, right? And I think that's an important piece, not just jump on the hype.
well, and this gets to the question I wanted to ask you, because you're telling this Palm Pilot story, and the other thing it made me think of is, I don't know if you remember the year that like it was really cool to have those clickers for kids
Oh
to
yeah,
take like quizzes in your classroom, like,
I had
and
one of
we
those.
all thought it was like the coolest thing. They were purple, and everybody had them, and this is like the coolest thing. We can see the results right away. And it makes me realize, like, we have been through a lot of technology. We act like this AI is new, but like schools have done this. We've gone through and added things multiple times. And I read this article recently that said education is going to change more in the next 5 years than it has in the last 50. But I think about our clickers and our Palm Pilots and think maybe not. What do you think? Are we going to change more in the next 5 than we did in the last 50?
So I'll say in some places yes, in some places no,
Interesting.
because
Who's going to benefit?
well, I would say those that are in the suburbs that have people that look primarily like us are often those that lead with innovation. And also when you look from an end of like teacher retention, teacher recruitment, teacher training in urban schools and very rural areas. So I think it's going to be like it is. This is what I'm starting to get at, is the equity side of it, where kids lose out is often some of our inner cities or most rural areas where lack of funding is there. And a lot of those places, they don't always have the professional learning that's needed, the funding to be able to support some of this, the funding to be able to buy some things that need to be purchased here, right? So with that, my fear is it becomes even a wider gap when it comes to equity, the digital use divide, and also just from when you look at just the demographics of our nation. I think 5 years from now, you'll see an even wider gap if we're not intentional about making sure that those things don't happen. And so, yeah, 5 years from now, you'll have some districts that look pretty much the exact same as they do today. Why? Because every other innovation that we've seen, even when it came to the internet, and people were like, oh, what if kids Google questions and just put it on their essay? Which is kind of the same question people are asking right now, right? Like if things in some places didn't change a whole lot then, some places won't. However, in some places, I think we're going to see a whole lot of change that's very, very different. I think we'll see some of our best teachers coming out with new ideas, new ways of doing things. And maybe if I share, do I have time for one more quick story of something that I
Do
think is
it.
up
Let's
here?
go. I don't think I could leave without it. So go for it.
So I was working with teachers in Michigan around AI and some it was more of an overall ed tech and effective use of ed tech, but of course we wanted to dive into AI. And so I asked people to put yourself in one of 3 buckets. First, I'm all in. I'm already using it. I see all the benefits and what piece That's one. Another one is like, I see some benefits. I'm a little bit hesitant. I see a lot of needs of like worries, guardrails, anxiety. Third one is like lock and block. Don't ever talk to me about it again. I hope it goes away. And so I started with that group and I said, just be honest. Like, I'm not here to judge. Like, we've got people, I guarantee, in all three. So it was working with high school teachers. And to no surprise, there was a lot of English folks in that lock and block, hope it never happens again. Because let's be real, nobody wants a kid going to ChatGPT, writing an essay, and turning it in. That benefits nobody. There's so many issues that nobody wants that, but that's part of the fear, right? So I said, what if we start this conversation around AI with what's in it for you as educators? So they all kind of looked at me and I said, all right, high school English folks, totally get where you're at. Thank you for being honest. Let's start here. Tell me what you teach. Like, give me a content thing you teach, give me the A level. And they said, all right, Shakespeare high school seniors. So I went into ChatGPT, and yes, AI goes far beyond that. Let's recognize that. I go into ChatGPT. I said, let's just do this together in real time. Let's start with what's in it for you. Let's find some value here. So I went into ChatGPT and explained, the prompt really matters here. It doesn't know when I'm starting out. If I'm a doctor, I'm a third grade teacher, or I'm an architect. So let's give it some context. I said, think like a high school English teacher and give me 3 activities that I can do with my high school seniors around Shakespeare. And so, seconds later, 3 different activities popped out. And I said, we're live here. You don't pull my chain. Don't do it just for me. We didn't set this up. What do you think of the 3 activities? Just take a look. Let me ask you this question first. Have you done any of those activities? They hadn't done any of the 3. I said, all right, just from a first question, I just got 3 different ideas. I'm not saying they're good, just 3 different ideas. Can we agree on that? They all said yes. So take a look at them. Do you like any of them? They actually all really liked the first one. The first one said, create a short play where Shakespeare characters have to remain true to who they are, but it takes place in a modern Starbucks. And they were all like, that's actually pretty cool. And I was like, have any of you done that before? They said, no. I said, all right, we've been doing this now for about a minute. Can we recognize you as a teacher? It can give you some ideas. And they were all like, I never really thought about it like that. And I said, so just if we started there, it can prompt ideas, because I know what it's like being a teacher, being like, I've done this 47 times. I'm out of ideas. What if it was just an idea generator? And then I said, all right, let's take it one step further. Y'all use rubrics? And of course they smiled and laughed. And I said, how many domains do you typically have in a rubric? They said 5. I said, all right, take activity 1 and create me a rubric with 5 domains based on 50 points. Spits it out. And I said, I want to be really clear. Would I ever say, print this out and hand it to kids? Absolutely not. But have we all been there at 11 o'clock at night trying to write the 30th block on a rubric and being like, how am I going to make it different between the 3 and the 4? Like, did it give you 70% of a starting space? And they all looked at it and their eyes got pretty big. I'm like, does it give us a spot to start? They all shook their head. And I said, do you care about parents? And they all laughed. I said, write a one-page letter to parents based on activity 1. And I said, look, I want to be clear. Do not just send that home. But is it a conversation starter or give you some ideas on ways parents could help with this project or ask questions? What if we said include in there 3 questions to ask kids about this project so they have things, and all of a sudden 3 more questions pop up? I said, do we have something that's a starting point that you could use to send to parents? And their eyes were huge. And I said, all right, translate to Spanish. And it translated to Spanish. I said, I need to be clear. Don't send that home. But can I work down to world languages and my Spanish colleague, or my colleague that teaches Spanish? And can I say, hey, can you help me edit this? Because I really want to make sure that my parents that only speak Spanish are able to do that. I'm going to make sure I do that real quick before I just send that out. Don't send that out. And their eyes were huge. That was a 7 to 8 minute conversation. And I said, let's bring it back. Can we just start by agreeing, if at a minimum, it can take me as a teacher, a great teacher that you are, and give me ideas, give me thoughts, and help me with things? At a minimum, there's a lot of value there. They spent their lunch, I kid you not. They spent your lunch, that was a morning session, redesigning by using ChatGPT, something they were collaboratively doing as a whole. And they afterwards, after lunch, came running over and said, oh my gosh, we got this great idea. Look what we're going to do. And they morphed it as their own. They're not just printing it out and handing it out. That's malpractice. It's going to happen in some spots, but it's malpractice. They used it as an idea generator to support it, and it had richer content to be able to have richer discussions because of it. So I would guess part of looking at it is selfish. We can be selfish as human beings, looking at it like, what's in it for me? If anything, as an educator, just that starting point of, hey, like, this can help you gain some ideas, get some ideas to do things differently, look and research for things, and also make sure when you're showing for kids, show them that not all things are right. I have a friend that shared out the other day. He looked up his bio in Chat GPT and it said he was dead. He's still breathing. That's not good, right?
Well, I
And
mean, he
so we
looked it
can,
up.
yeah, and even from a kid end, just like I could go on about this all day, but as a kid end, like show kids, right? Because here's the reality: if we pretend like, hey, we're just going to lock it and block it, they're pulling out their
Right.
phone and they're checking it out anyway, right? Like, let's not be
Right.
naive here, folks. But what if we started with students and said, look, there's a lot of resources out there that can help us with writing. Day one, we're not using any tech because you need to be able to communicate without it as a first part. We're going to write a 3-paragraph essay. Today, you're going to focus just on you. And then day two, you can use any technology out there in the world that you want to help you write it. Why? Because that's called real life. That's what I do in my job and every other professional can do in their job. But day three, we're going to now put them together and you're going to highlight all the pieces to cite accurately where you got ideas from. And then you're going to hand me your original, the one that you used with different resources. And then you're going to hand me a final version and things are going to be highlighted that you're citing where you got different ideas. Why might I do something like that? Because I'm teaching kids appropriate use, show them what you don't want, show them how things are wrong in certain places, and then show them that because that's real life, right? And when I talk about personal and authentic, that's the authentic side to say, hi, we should be able to do this. Why? Because you and I can do it every day, right? And so with that,
Right.
teach them to use things well. Let's not lock and block because if that's the case, we're putting our head in the sand.
I feel like you again, like you run and run, and I have to come back to what the one thing that I really want to catch here is 20 minutes ago, maybe more like 30. I asked you, I said, how does a district leader lead AI human centered? And you just gave us the answer, right? The first thing you said is you asked them, what do you teach that you want to talk about, right? They chose Shakespeare. That's what we're going to talk about. Don't force it down their throat. Ask them what they want to talk about and then show them how to use the tool. And every single time you brought them along, can you agree? We don't have to agree to everything. Let's agree to this little part, one piece at a time. And I think that is super human centered. And I don't want to miss that because that's the playbook we all need right now.
Yeah, it goes back to the why. I love Simon Sinek's work. And, we've talked about the why, the what, the how for a long time now. But when people see the why, there's a reason to change. When I look at it from a vulnerability end, I might look at it and be like, man, I need to lose a few pounds. And then I go to like Wawa down the street, which is like a hoagie place. And I'm like, I'll start tomorrow. However, if somebody said to me, true story here, if somebody said, your daughter's life depends on it and you need 5 pounds by next Friday, I would have it done by like 2 days from now. Why? Because my why is big enough to get it done. And I know that sounds like crazy example, but it proves to me if I wanted to be able to do it bad enough, I'd do it. I figured it out. And I think we saw those kinds of things, as well during COVID, where we grew so much when it came to ed tech stuff because we had to. We had no choice. If you couldn't figure out how to send a Zoom link, you weren't connecting with your kids. So people figured it out really quickly. And so I think when our why is large enough where we can see it and look at it with a different lens, and I think the same is going to be true for AI, but just start with how can this make me better? How can this help my kids? If we argue about cheating and copyright for the next 8 years without doing anything, we've totally missed it. Do we need to have some of those conversations? Of course we do. We've always had to. That doesn't change, right? And so we can't lose sight of that.
All right, Tom, I think I might have to ask you to come back. I would love to do one more session with you just on how do we make AI work for the kids who need it the most, right? The kids who don't look like you and me, the kids who are not in the suburbs, because so much of what you've given us is for like leaders and teachers and students. But I think we said at the very beginning, right? Like it's either gonna help the kids. The worst case scenario is it helps the kids who already have the most and hurts the kids who already have the least. So we might be doing that again. But today we're going to do our 5 questions we ask everybody here at the end. This has been such a great conversation. The first question is the podcast is called More Than a Test, and we have a reason for that here at Amira, but everybody thinks it means something different. When you heard more than a test, what did it mean to you?
I'll go back to that human side, right? When I look at it through the eyes of my own children, at the end of the day, our test score is important. You could argue all sides of that on one end. Of course, I want my kids to know the stuff that they have to know. But my child is more than a test. I'll tell you that, right? The mental health side, the people side, their heart side, things like empathy, social interactions. Those are the kinds of things that don't show up on a test. So schooling is also much more than a test.
That's really lovely. All right. We're a reading company, so we always ask people to tell us a lit moment. And what we mean by that is not your favorite book, but a moment of you in a book that either changed your life or is your happy place or a memory you keep?
Ooh. Hmm. It's going to be totally random, but it's the first one to pop into mind. I believe we need to read books that have nothing to do with education when we think about things like leadership and culture and people that we can relate to education. And so I love to read books on businesses in those places. I'm also, from a personal end, I think we got to do things from a personal end. I'm very much into financial literacy, very much into like making sure my family is well set into the future. If I was in education, I would do something with finance. And so a book that totally changed my life that I'll give a shout out to is called The Millionaire Next Door. And the reason I share that is because it really gets down to what people perceive as wealth in the country. Actually, it really isn't wealth. It's normally debt. And people that have the money, you really actually wouldn't know that they do. Why I share that is because what I took away from that is things aren't always what they appear. Things aren't always what they look. And a lot of time we make assumptions based on the way things look, like in that case, wealth, and people have really big houses and all that kind of stuff. Actually, the research shows that's not where the wealth is. It's kind of in middle class America with families that have been together for a long time, kind of those pieces. So what it appears versus what it actually looks like are very two different things. And there's a lot of things we can connect to equity, to education, to race, to all those pieces from that lesson there as well. Totally unrelated to education, but personal, and then connecting it to the work we do every day. Hmm. I'm going to go with YouTube because I see the passion in the creation and CapCut as well
I
that
haven't
my
read it.
own
I'll look it up.
children are
All right, a
doing
piece of
to create
technology you love.
videos to learn how to story tell what they're passionate about. So I'll say CapCut in combination with YouTube. Man, these are some good ones that you want real quick hitters. Um, it goes back to the
All
kid
right,
first,
the
human
best
centered.
advice you were ever
That
given?
whole side of things was a mentor that I tell my first my first year about
Yeah.
not making things more about me and making sure that I'm focused on them. And so part of it was that notion of really looking in the mirror and saying, who's this work really about? I'm certainly a value and a part of that, but I was focused on some of the wrong stuff. And so a mentor kind of giving me the kick in the butt in a loving way, helping me refocus on what it is that mattered most. So it's funny you asked that because I pulled it out and was like, I wonder if I could share it. I just started. I'm going to give a shout out to my buddies Ken Shelton and Dee Lanier because we had this conversation on AI. They just wrote a book called The Promises and
Awesome. And one
Perils of
book you think
AI in
everyone should read?
Education. And I love their subtitle, by the way. Ethics and Equity Have Entered the Chat. So here it is. Great shout out. I've just started it, but I know both of them. They're two of the most equity oriented people that you will. They're passionate about ed tech and its possibilities, but they also keep it very real in some of the guardrails and some of the things around biasy and some of the biases and those types of things, biases and those things that we really need to be conscious of, because things like AI will amplify really bad things as well if that corpus isn't what it needs to be. And so that's a shout out I'm going to give to Ken and to Dee on that. I've just started it. Great book. It's been all over social media. Make sure to check that out.
All right, I'm putting it on my list. Thank you so much. This has been a great conversation.
Thanks for having me, and for everybody listening, thanks for the work that you do each and every day and then changing lives.
Thanks for joining us on the More Than a Test podcast. If you found this conversation valuable, subscribe to our YouTube channel and find us on your favorite podcast platform. At Amira Learning, we believe every child deserves a chance to become a reader, and we're excited to be part of this conversation. See you next week, and thanks for joining.